All right. I called this The Eye of the Storm, and it's about academia and gaining recognition of matriarchal studies. And I have a picture of Heide Göttner-Abendroth there on the right, which I think is a very lovely portrait of her. It was when we were in St. Gallen, Italy, or Switzerland. Most of you probably remember that. And I call it the eye of the storm. We have a lot of hurricanes and tornadoes in North America. And everyone knows that the front end comes in violently, and then there's a little lull, and then the back end comes in, and it can be worse than the front end of trying to wipe off everything. And unless you know that, you might go out in the lull and think you've won. Back into the storm still coming. So I call it the eye of the storm, weathering this attempt to gain recognition. All right. I noticed the Venus of Willendorf here on the left, and then the Venus de Milo. And by the way, it was Westerners that called Willendorf Venus because that's their mindset. But if you look at her, you can see she's obviously very pregnant, and she obviously is getting a lot of milk, heavy in her breasts. These are things that women use as symbols of matriarchy across the world. I've always been interested in that cap, and I could never tell whether that was a braided hair or if that was a knitted cap. Probably a mark of some kind of officialdom. Hats off on her. On the right, instead of somebody who is the bloodline progenitrix, we see Venus de Milo, who's obviously titillation for the male gaze. And I think it's interesting she has no arms. Notice the arms on Willendorf. She's kind of taking care of breasts. Any of you that have children and had your breasts all know that it can be kind of painful. Here, this Venus on the right kind of lacks in that area, also lacks arms to comfort herself. And notice that her private genitals are covered up with a sheet. That's another sign of patriarchy. Whereas Willendorf is right out there for everybody to see because women in matriarchies are not ashamed of or careful of their bodies in that way of showing who they are. Okay, so the question I ask is what happened between those two eras, about 15,000 years? One of the first things I found was ancient Greek propaganda against women. Second is the Hyksos invasion of Egypt. Third is the development of monotheism, which is connected with both of those developments. And then finally, the so-called Age of Discovery. That's a European description of itself as the age of imperial colonialism, spreading Western culture worldwide. So let's look at the Greeks here. I went out and looked for all these different reliefs of Greeks and so-called Amazons, the Amazonian women. And you can find an awful lot of these depictions. The ancient Greeks were obviously terrified of women who would defend themselves. And in this relief on the left, you can see two women holding their own. And this Greek warrior knows he's naked. They dress to go into battle. He undresses to go into battle. How interesting. So he's got a shield. She's got a shield. She's got a shield on the right. And frankly, it looks to me like he's toast. On the right, the relief on the right, you see a woman slashing at a soldier who's trying to come at her again. It looks like she's got the upper hand. Although below her is a woman who has succumbed. Now, what are all these about? The Greeks were terrified and horrified by the women they called the Amazons. Interestingly enough, modern research has shown that the so-called Amazons weren't in Africa, they weren't in South America, they were Ukrainians. Of all things, Ukrainians. Um, and their culture was not this endless warrior culture that the Greeks are depicting. Interestingly, the Amazons weren't invading the Greeks were practicing their raids on the Scythians, the Amazons, and the others who were up north of them and east of them. So these women were defending themselves, they weren't attacking, although that's not the way the Greek propaganda presented it. It presented this as a horrifying reminder of what could happen if women were allowed power. And I'm sure you've all read various Greek philosophers who held that in immense horror. Here are some more depictions of the horrible Amazonian women. And again, whenever I see a hat, especially a large hat, I am pretty sure that's connected to some sign of office, officialdom. Here on the right, you've got a fellow taking advantage of the fact that she has long hair to grab her hair and drag her back. I like the one on the left a little better. She's obviously in charge. All right, so what we've got is Herodotus, and he wrote the histories which are still read today. They were inflicted on me when I was a grad student, when I was actually a student before a grad student. And everybody has to read them so you get the old Greek propaganda about things. Here they are talking about the Suromate, who were the so-called Amazons, and how they combined with the Scythians. But they say the name Oiropata means killers of men. Probably that was just the Greek general for humankind. They're killers. And this always interested me because Native America was also presented as killers of Europeans, hideous, bloodthirsty savages, which of course was not the truth. Matriarchies do everything in their power and structure law, as Mary Condren just showed, to keep people from fighting. But you come kick us in the shins, we're going to defend ourselves. That's what's not allowed in the patriarchal mind. So you've got Herodotus doing a real hatchet job on the so-called Amazons. And then we have the learned editor of the 1998 Oxford edition of it, says the Amazons are a foreign band of warrior women. What makes them foreign? They're not Greek. And anybody not Greek was called barbarian, which meant bearded, although obviously the women did not have beards. But they are the ancestresses of these Scythian neighbors who intermarried, and this is really interesting. If you've got a group that's absolutely hostile to your existence and is bloodthirsty, that group's going to kill, it's not going to marry. But these people married, which is an old, long-standing tactic for ensuring peace. So it tells you that the story Herodotus is giving is propaganda and not actually what was going on with these women. All right, so we got the Greeks there on the shelf. Now, any of you who have read Diop knows that he makes the argument, and by the way, Middle Eastern scholars, Muslim scholars also make this argument, that ancient Greece was actually part of the Middle East. And I think given the culture, mindsets, the patriarchy, I think that was probably true. Ancient Egypt is another matter. And again, I like Diop's presentation of the idea that Egypt was able to develop peacefully for thousands of years because it had natural barriers of desert, of ocean, of marshes. People couldn't get across to come commit mayhem as they were doing in the so-called Middle East. So it wasn't until the Hyksos invasion that Egypt found itself in a position of having to defend itself. And you see the Hyksos there on the right. Now, between 1800 and 1580, before the Common Era, they seized control of Egypt. Modern new historians are trying to present the Hyksos as already in Egypt as peaceful immigrants. That may or may not be true. I don't think the case has been proven yet. But clearly some were already in Egypt. They may have been a fifth column because after they were there and saw how wealthy Egypt was, Next thing you know, you see these guys in chariots come swooping in, flailing away. And if you've got a horse in a chariot and the other guy's on foot, two guesses as to who's going to win. On top of that, Middle Easterners had tall horses. The only horses that Egyptians had at that time were little itty bitty, they looked like Shetland ponies. They were about that size. And they did not use the animal to race chariots or commit mayhem. Instead, they were mainly farmers and artisans. This is a depiction of the Hyksos being dragged back out, driven out by force. And you can see how they're connected at the neck by some sort of rope that's pulling them along. Whether or not they want to go, they're just being expelled from Egypt after all the mayhem they committed. What happened was Egypt had been a parallel culture, a male female about equivalent power, which is connected to matriarchy and is maybe a descending form of matriarchy. Yamadum seems to think so. But in any case, in order to drive out the Hyksos, look on the left, they had to start using the chariots and the horses too. So what happened was they got co-opted by patriarchal urges. Anytime you see violence being entertained, you've started a downhill slide. So what happened were changes in modes of production and items of production. You started seeing military tools replacing farm tools or building tools, and you started seeing technology put to the purpose of war instead of the purpose of the people. You started seeing oppression of a weak other. You don't tie a rope around a man's neck and drag him on his knees unless you're into a bit of oppression there. And you started seeing a new moral code justifying the shifts, the cultural shifts. So Egypt was militarized. Anytime you're getting a militarization of a culture, you're getting a patriarchal strong push in that culture. And I think that the installation of monotheism in Egypt was part and parcel of that. We've all heard of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, blah, blah, blah. And they're usually presented in Western texts as, oh, these wonderful people who installed monotheism, but it was too early for the primitive Egyptians to deal with it, and they drove them out. I think they drove them out because they didn't want patriarchy. If you know anything about Northern and Central Africa, you know they were pretty strong matriarchal roots there. Matriarchy will go for peace if it can. Egypt liked peace. Egypt got along best when there was peace. So I think they were driving out Akhenaten because anytime you got that solitary male god, you've got a warrior culture. And I think Egypt just did not want that, my opinion. What you had in the Middle East, even if it was driven out of Egypt, was Zoroastrianism as the organized cult of the one god in Persia, rose in Persia. Interestingly, although you hear these monotheists running all over talking about how wonderful it is that there's a God of everyone, that is not at all what monotheism was and started at. It was just that one of the multiplicity of gods was going to be the God of this or that people, which is why Daniel recounts the deity war between the Hebrew God and the God of the other folks that were around the Babylonians, Marduk. Interestingly, again, the Jewish singular male god looks like it might be a knockoff of the old Canaanite god El. Seems very likely. In any case, the Persian cult started popularizing the idea of one God. And if your culture is big enough and you've got one God and you're going out conquering, you're going to carry this portable little God with you everywhere. And it's going to start looking like there's only one God. That was picked up in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I don't think it's accidental that all these philosophers back in this time, Thales, Miletus, Plato, and all the rest, going down to Kepler here, are looking for the unifying principle Today they call it the theory of everything. That's really a boy heavy kind of a search. That's not the sort of thing you're going to see in a matriarchy. Um, to my interest, they decided on water as the unifying principle. Makes some sense on a water planet like Earth, but by and large, water is connected with amniotic fluid, connected with matriarchy. But Plato, in his dialogue Timaeus, was looking for the one thing as well, and he called it the demiurge. And you start seeing this go into Christian thought. The idea of the divine craftsman is pretty much a deist idea. So when deism developed in the 18th century, is actually a reversion to Platonic divine craftsman. Created all the original forms, and the rest of us are just knockoffs. So that goes into Judaic thought, kinda. If you look at the original Jewish tradition, you have a pretty parallel color. You've got the matriarchs as well as the patriarchs, and the women got equal billing of the men for quite a while. Even in the opening of the Jesus story, women got um, some top billing, Elizabeth, Mary, and all of that. But then they're getting pushed out. So you're seeing all this Hellenization, which is the Middle Easternization of thought, especially in this unifying principle that winds up the one God. So monotheism becomes a thing. I found this cartoon on the right. It's all these men sitting around at a conference table looking very harumpful. The women, of course, behind having to serve them. And the head of the table says, "So, boys, what's this patriarchy thing all those women are talking about? Yeah, what is it?" After the Hellenization of thought and these larger militaristic empires arrive, things are going really downhill for matriarchy. I found this interesting triptych. It's in the Reichstag Museum. Aaron, Miriam, and Moses. And if you've forgotten your Bible studies, Aaron and Miriam were siblings of Moses. Moses had a very bad stutter. He couldn't talk, so Aaron had to talk for him. Miriam, however, was the shaman. She was the priestess. The only direct quote in the entire old, so-called Old Testament or Torah is Miriam. After they get through the Sea of Reeds, not the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, she starts singing and holding a festival, and the direct quote of what she's saying is right there. That's kind of important in my mind. It's showing that there's still that urge, but it's quickly drowned out by Jesus. I found this oldest known image of him, looking kind of Jewish, but notice the very phallic finger gesture. And on the right there, you've got minarets, very phallic kind of papa and sun minarets. Always kills me that somehow this is not seen. Now, what happens is this follows colonialism around the world. And it's not just Christianity that was forced on the rest of the world, on Native America, on Northern Eurasia and Asia, not to mention Europe, Southern Africa, Australia, all over the place. It's just pushed anywhere the Europeans went or anywhere the Muslims went with their invasion. Uh, Indians pushed them back out some, although there was more Muslim presence in India than I think is being shown on this map. But you can see how that idea was imposed, and it was imposed by violence, by sheer violence. And when the Europeans got here to the Americas, they flatly connected us with the Scythians and the Amazons because the women would stand and fight. So that hatchet job's still going on. I saw this movie, look at the date, 2011. 2011, this comes out. It's called The Burning Man, and it's about the horrors of a matriarchal society where once a year they burn a man alive. Whoa, whoa, can't trust those women with power. So part of spreading patriarchy was the constant hatchet job on women's ability to have and wield power. And matriarchy, starting about the 18th century flatly dismissed as a myth, even though they'd seen matriarchy at work around the world, flatly dismissing it. I think it might have been a hysterical reaction. In any case, it's dismissed from the academy, and anybody who disagrees with that point of view is given a really hard time, and if they persist, they'll be thrown out on their ear. I pulled up Cynthia Eller, who's one of the big modern spokespeople for this no such thing as matriarchy notion in the academy. This book, Gentlemen and Amazons, came out. Well, gentlemen, not ladies, Amazons, came out in 2011. And she gives the blurb that matriarchy is all this male myth. 2011. This book traces the 19th century genesis development of an important contemporary myth about human origins, that of an original prehistoric matriarchy. Dun dun. It explores the intellectual history of the myth, which arose from male scholars. She means Bakova. Provides the necessary context for understanding how feminists, the evil ones of the 1970s and 1980s, embraced as historical fact, in quotation marks, a discredited 19th century idea. This has been the standing pattern. It's been disputed. I think it's interesting that in 2012, matriarchal societies came out. But there's a lot more evidence, and I only threw up a few of them here, especially Lafitau, who very closely documented in 1724 the Iroquois democracy. I've noticed an awful lot of American scholars do not speak any language but English. But if you can speak and read other languages, you're going to find a whole lot of research they just totally ignore. Lafitau being one. His study is skewed. He was very upset or nonplussed by the matriarchy he found, but he documented it. And of course, you got Bakov in there. You've got Diop and his really important work. And I think it's quite important. He's a Senegalese scholar. He started out in science, wound up in humanities. France wouldn't give him the time of day when he tried to publish his work on the matriarchy of Africa. They wouldn't give him another look. And it wasn't until he got his PhD and out on his own that he started publishing his actual research, which is very important research. I use in my classes. And this is the bibliography that Dr. Göttner-Abendroth was talking about. Way back in 2010, Oxford, who is one of my publishers and probably the most notable of my publishers, ABC Clio might dispute that, but it's a white shoe publisher, which is American slang. It means top of the line. They came to me and they said, we've noticed matriarchal studies are really taking off, and we would like you to do a bibliography of all the research on it so that we can get a start here. And I knew I was the wrong person to put it together, but I was the one they offered the contract to, so I took it. And then I negotiated with Oxford and I said, may I bring in a co-author? And I negotiated to have Dr. Göttner-Abendroth come in. And I just stood back and let Heide do it because I knew she was the right person to do it. And I was very proud to be able to get this contract with Oxford University Press to bring out a massive, major matriarchal studies bibliography because that is pretty much the seal of approval, and I thought was only appropriate for Dr. Göttner-Abendroth, who'd been so mistreated, I think, by academia. I thought that was just a wonderful thing, a gift to be able to give. And I think it's important to point out, as Mary Condren just pointed out, Indigenous people never lost mama, never forgot about mother. And I just pulled up some few, like Amadou. Her work is wonderful. I recommend it. Of course, there's Iroquois women, which was mentioned mine. Peggy Reeves Sandy on the Maninkabau. Shan Chandu on the Lahu of Western China. Makilam on Kabila women, Berber women. And those are just the ones I could fit on the page. I mean, I could have gone on and on, but I ran out of page. So I was very pleased to be able to get that going with Oxford. And you might have noticed that we've just recently had an update that we had to negotiate through. It took a lot, but we got through in 2020, so it's been updated. The bibliography has. Um, on October 7th, 2013, Dr. Göttner-Abendroth was making a book tour, speaking tour to promote the book, Matriarchal Societies. And I'm in the Honors College. My good friend Sharon Barnes runs Women and Gender Studies, which was a proper venue to be the sponsor of record. So I dragged Sharon into it, and we got the big presentation. It was well attended for students, for faculty, interested community members. We had a nice turnout. And as you see, Dr. Göttner-Abendroth made a very nice presentation on the book. And I like that photograph. I think maybe Sharon snapped that. She was just about to get up and speak. Heide was. And then here it was more relaxed at a dinner in one of the many wonderful Muslim restaurants, Middle Eastern restaurants in this area. So, of course, Dr. Göttner-Abendroth is right there in the center. So she's into the storm, and I think with the Oxford publication out the other side, I don't think anybody's ever going to dispute the reality of matriarchal studies again. Let's see, how do I stop sharing here? There we go. All right.